Hello and welcome back to another episode of FightOrFlight. This time I wanted to show you my flight planning and procedures for PMDG's 737NGX. I'm flying the NGX a lot at the moment and only stick to short routes as my aim is to get as familiar as possible with the flight deck. The procedure I'm showing you today is just my own personal procedure. It's by no means the only way to do it, and I won't pretend that it's as real as it gets. I just find that it gets me into the air as quickly as possible. As you'll see, I use quite a lot of add-ons in Prepar3D, so let's get to it. Our flight today will take us from Split in Croatia to Parma in Italy. The airports are freeware Orbx airports, and as we're using real weather, we can be pretty sure that the weather situation in that part of the world won't give us any problems. After we've decided on our destination, it's time for us to set up the weather. I'm using Active Sky next, and for the purposes of this video, I'm using the incredibly useful historical weather mode so you can follow along if you like. The date is set to April 8th, 2015 at 3 o'clock Universal Time. Let's check out our departure airport. Split Airport has an ICAO code of LDSP, and Active Sky next is showing clear skies with a northwesterly wind. Our destination is Parma Airport in Italy that has the unfortunate ICAO code of LIMP or LIMP. As our route is fairly short, there's not much difference in the conditions between the two airports. Now we can move over to Professional Flight Planner X. I use PFPX over SimBrief purely for the fact that SimBrief doesn't support SIDS and stars, and PFPX also integrates TopCat for our performance data. There are plenty of tutorials online for setting up PFPX, so I won't go into it too much, but this is how I do it. The airline and flight number are optional. I'm a member of Ryanair Virtual, so let's use Ryanair as the airline with a random flight number and fill in the from and to fields. PFPX is set to use our Active Sky next weather, and it automatically calculates the takeoff and landing runways based on the wind. As we can see, the flight should take just over an hour to complete. We'll select the NGX for the flight and hit Random Payload. The important number we need is the 0 fuel weight, which we'll use later. Next, we'll click Quick Find Route, and just check it over to make sure everything looks okay. PFPX automatically picked the wind optimized route together with a SID and a star. Unfortunately, PFPX doesn't support transitions, so we'll have to choose one manually from the FMC when we set up our route in the NGX. A more detailed way of selecting a SID and star is to find the real-world charts and make sure we select the correct procedures based on our aircraft type, but to be honest, PFPX does a pretty good job of selecting the correct one, so we'll just leave it as it is. We'll hit Find Destination Alternates, and finally, Compute Flight. At this point, we have all the information we need to complete the flight. But as I use TopCat, we'll go ahead and add that data to the flight plan. First of all, click Takeoff. We can leave the default settings as they are and hit Calculate. Apply that. Then the same for landing. TopCat defaults to flaps 40, so we'll select the standard flaps 30 for landing. Calculate and apply. My flight plan template is based on a KLM template I found online. I modified it quite a bit and also added some NGX specific sections to help me set up quickly in the sim. Now we can release the flight and print the flight plan as a PDF. I usually sync it to Dropbox and view it on an iPad. The last thing we need to do in PFPX is export the route in NGX and prepared formats. Now we can finally jump into the sim. Now we're in the sim, I'd like to talk about some basic options for the NGX. I always use the panel state of NGX long. It lets me set up a few things, and I believe it's a little more realistic than starting up cold and dark every time. I have my IRS alignment set to realistic, as it gives me around 8 to 10 minutes to set everything up and gives me enough time to make sure I haven't missed anything. I also fly with service-based failures switched on, just to make things a little more interesting. Hopefully nothing bad happens during the recording of this flight. An add-on that I'd recommend to any FSX or P3D user is PDF Kneeboard. It's free and it allows you to load in various charts and other documents and lets you display them directly in the sim. You can set up various key commands to switch pages and even to switch between documents. As you can see, I've got the flight plan we generated loaded into PDF kneeboard for quick reference, and I went ahead and downloaded the necessary charts from Eurocontrol. Eurocontrol is also free and just requires a sign up. From Split, we're flying the Zarda 6 Papa SID, which takes us along this route. Then we're flying the Lupos 1 Alpha Star into Parma, followed by the ILS Yankee approach. For our approach, we'll hit the Parma DME, then fly towards IPR and a heading of 016. At Sucsil, we'll enter a holding pattern, and at 7.2 miles from IPR, we'll turn onto a heading of 196 and intercept the localizer, followed by the glide slope. As we're approaching from the southeast, you'll notice that the NGX autopilot actually follows the dotted line seen on the chart. The first thing I like to do is start the stopwatch and set the alignment process in motion. We can switch on the window heat and set the pressurization. Our cruise altitude is flight level 380 and the elevation for Parma Airport is 161 feet. Now we'll listen to Active Sky Next ATIS for our QNH and set that.
Lima Delta Sierra Papa Airport Information Hotel 0230 Zulu Weather Wind 336 at 6 Visibility 10 Sky Clear Temperature 6 Dew Point -5 QNH 1025 Advise on initial contact. You have information Hotel Lima Delta Sierra Papa Airport Information Hotel.
For our payload, we need the 0 fuel weight from our flight plan. After this, we go to the fuel page and enter our release fuel. In POS Init, enter our current airport LDSP and the GPS position for IRS. Our route is LDSP to LIMP, and we'll load the company route generated by PFPX. Takeoff runway is 23. Activate the route, now the departure and arrival page. Runway 23, SID is Zarda 6 Papa, execute. Standard arrival for Parma is Lupos 1 Alpha and ILS Yankee with Sucsil as the transition, execute the star. We'll just step through our route to make sure everything looks okay and that there are no discontinuities. I believe the discontinuity here is due to the fact that in the real world you would wait for ATC clearance before entering the hold. There's no ATC today, so we'll just remove it. The blue dotted line here represents the missed approach, should we require it. Back to the init page for our performance data. Use the NGX 0 fuel weight trick, a reserve of 1.0, and a typical Ryanair cost index of 6. Cruise altitude is flight level 380 and average top of climb wind is 038 by 65 knots. I read somewhere that a good rule of thumb for transition altitude is to take the transition altitude published for the airport and add 1000. In our case, it's 10,500. Execute. Next, we'll set up the D rate. Topcat gave us a takeoff 2 D rate together with an assumed temperature of 34 degrees. Now, take off page 2 and enter the runway wind 310 by 5, and as always with Prepared, a slope of 0. Back to page 1 and enter 1 for the flaps. Finally, we perform a similar trick for centre of gravity, and this gives us our V speeds. You'll notice that they are slightly different than the ones that Top Cat gave us. This is because the Top Cat V-speeds don't take the wind into account. We'll just quickly cross-reference the takeoff weight with our flight plan, and minus taxi fuel, everything looks good. That's it for the CDU pre-flight. Now is a good time to set the trim to around 5.27. Now we'll enter our runway heading and V2 speed into the MCP. We'll switch the flight directors on and engage the auto throttle. While we're waiting for the alignment to complete, I'll show you FS2Crew. I love this add-on. For those of you who don't know, FS2Crew is a voice-activated first officer that takes most of the workload away from you, the captain, and lets you concentrate on flying the plane. We'll open up the briefing page and run the departure brief.
Are you ready for the departure brief?
I'm ready for the brief.
Okay, we have no MEL issues today. I will be the pilot flying. It will be a standard takeoff using noise abatement departure procedure 1. The departure will be an ATC assigned SID. We will use flaps 1 for takeoff. Runway condition is dry. As for anti-ice, it's not required. Engine bleeds will be on. From 0 to 100 knots, for any malfunction I'll call reject and confirm the auto brakes are operating. If not operating, I will apply maximum manual braking and maximum symmetric reverse thrust and come to a full stop on the runway. After full stop on the runway, we make a decision on further action. From 100 knots to V1, I will only reject for one of the following 3 reasons: engine fire, engine failure, or a takeoff configuration warning horn. At and above V1 we'll continue into the air, and the only actions below 400 feet are for you to silence any alarm bells and confirm any failures. Above 400 feet I'll call for failure action drills as required, and you will perform memory items. At 800 feet above field elevation I'll call for altitude hold, and will retract the flaps on schedule. At 1500 feet I will call for the checklist. If we're above maximum landing weight, we'll make a decision on whether to perform an overweight landing as the situation requires. If we have a wheel well, engine or wing fire, I will turn the aircraft in such a way the flames will be downwind and we will evacuate via the upwind side. If we have a cargo fire, I want you to ensure the emergency services do not open the cargo doors until the evacuation is completed. Any questions?
No questions.
Departure brief complete.
It's worth mentioning that FS2Crew are currently working on a new version known as the NGX Reboot, which promises many more features and should be available soon. But in the meantime, this older version works just fine for now. With the departure briefing completed, we can move on to our first voice-activated checklist. FS2Crew expect a certain response to the checklist items, but as a fallback you can simply reply set to any checklist item that you may not know the correct response to. You'll hear me saying set for a few things. I'll ask my virtual FO for the first checklist. Pre-flight checklist.
Oxygen.
Tested 100%.
Instrument transfer and display switches.
Normal. Auto.
Window heat.
On.
Pressurization and mode selector.
Auto.
Flight instruments.
Set.
Parking brake.
Set.
Engine start levers.
Cut off.
Pre-flight checklist complete.
Now that the alignment is completed, we can shortly engage VNAV and LNAV on the MCP. If they both light up, it's a good indication that everything was set up correctly during the CDU pre-flight. The Boeing Flight Crew Training Manual recommends departing with VNAV on, so we'll leave that engaged. We would normally enter our first altitude restriction in the MCP, but as we effectively don't have one for this flight, we'll set it to our cruise altitude for simplicity. Now we'll turn on the APU, and after it's switched on, we'll ask our FO to perform his before start procedure, then prepare for pushback. Before start procedure.
Check. I'm ready for the checklist when you are.
Before start checklist.
Flight deck door.
Closed and locked.
Fuel.
Set.
Passenger signs.
On.
Windows.
Locked.
MCP.
Set.
Takeoff speeds.
Set.
CDU pre-flight.
Completed.
Rudder and aileron trim.
3 and 0.
Taxi and takeoff briefing.
Completed.
Anti-collision light.
On.
Before start checklist complete.
Start sequence is 2, then 1.
Check.
Departure check completed, Captain. Bypass pin inserted. And release parking brakes, sir. Commencing the push, Captain. Start engine at your discretion.
Start engine 2.
Starting number 2. Starter cutout.
Start number 1.
Starting number 1. Starter cutout.
Set parking brakes, please. Captain, the tow truck is disconnected and the bypass pin is removed.
Flaps 1.
check.
Left and right, both clear.
Takeoff flaps set. I'm ready for the checklist when you are.
Before taxi checklist.
Generators.
On.
Prepar3D.
On.
Anti-ice.
Off.
Isolation valves.
Auto.
Engine start switches.
Continuous.
Recall.
Checked.
Water brake.
RTO.
Engine start levers.
Idle detent.
Flight controls.
Checked.
Ground equipment.
Clear.
Before taxi checklist complete.
Clear on the left.
Clear right.
Select taxi light on.
Hello, flight deck. Great, thank you. Captain, the cabin is secure.
Before takeoff checklist.
Flaps.
Flaps 1, green light.
Stabilizer trim.
Set.
Before takeoff checklist complete.
Runway entry procedure.
Check. Cabin crew, take your seats. Clear on the approach. Ready to go.
On runway 053,100 feet remaining.
Takeoff.
Check.
Caution.
Thrust
Short runway,
set.
Short runway.
$80 knots. V1. Rotate. Positive rate.
Gear up.
Gear up. VNav. Gear up, lights out.
Select LNAV.
LNav.
Flaps up.
Flaps up. I'm ready for the checklist when you are.
Select Command A.
Command A.
After takeoff checklist.
Engine bleeds. On. Packs. Auto. Landing gear. Up and off. Flaps. Up, no lights. After takeoff checklist. Complete. Flight level 100. Transition altitude, altimeters 1013.
We've just passed our top of climb and we're cruising at flight level 380. It's not long until we begin our descent, so we'll start the preparations now. First of all, let's listen to the Active Sky Next destination weather for the conditions at Palma.
Lima, India, Mike, Papa, airport information, Alpha 0338, Zulu, weather, wind 247, at 8, visibility 10, sky clear, temperature 5, dew point -4, QNH 1029. Advise on initial contact, you have information, Alpha, Lima, India, Mike, Papa, airport information, Alpha 0338, Zulu.
We'll be performing an ILS approach, so we'll use a barometric decision height. We'll take 200 feet as the decision height and add that to the elevation at Palma, which gives us a total of 361 feet. Next, we'll run the approach briefing for FS2Crew. The most important settings here are flaps, auto brake and decision height, as our first officer will use these for configuration. We initially planned for a flaps 30 landing, but as the runway at Palma is fairly short, we'll play it safe and select flaps 40 and auto brake 3. Now we can play the full brief or use a shortcut. We simply ask the FO if he's ready for the brief, then ask if there are any questions. We'll do that, then we'll notice the FO will go through the FMC and configure the plane for landing. Are you ready for the approach brief?
I'm ready for the brief.
Any questions?
No questions.
We'll set the MCP altitude to our altitude restriction for the approach, which is 2,000 feet.
I'm ready for the checklist.
Finally, we'll set our descent forecast. Transition altitude is 7,000, and as we have a descent wind forecast from PFPX, we'll go ahead and enter those values here. We may as well take advantage of the time we have and set up nav1 for our ILS frequency and set the runway heading in the MCP course indicator. Now we'll perform the descent checklist and wait until we begin our descent. Descent checklist.
Pressurization. Landing altitude 150 feet. Recall checked. Auto brake level 3. Landing data VREF 135. Minimums 361 feet. Approach briefing completed. Descent checklist complete. Flight level 100. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Transition level.
We're turning onto our final approach heading of 196 degrees with 5 degrees of flaps extended, and we've engaged Vorlock. The autoflight system didn't handle the racetrack as well as I'd expected, so I had to intervene with heading select. We'll be intercepting the glide slope shortly, at which point we'll start to configure the plane fully for landing.
Glide slope alive.
Gear down, flaps 15.
Gear down. Flaps 15.
Flaps 30.
Flaps 30.
Landing checklist.
Engine start switches.
Continuous.
Speed brake.
Armed.
Landing gear.
Down.
Flaps.
Flaps 40.
Flaps 40.
Flaps 40, green light.
Landing checklist complete.
I'll disengage the autopilot with a double click of the yoke button.
Approaching 20.
500 feet. Approaching minimums. Minimums.
Landing.
Check.
Lights low. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
Long landing. Long landing.
Speed brakes up. Reverse green. 60 knots.
Okay to clean up.
Check.
The landing was a bit long, but overall successful.
APU is online. Cabin crew disarm slides. Ready for shutdown.
Go ahead.
Okay, the chocks are in now.
Well, now we've come to the end of the video, and I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I did making it. I always like to watch flight sim videos on YouTube, as I always pick up tips on how other people do things. If you've got any suggestions on videos you'd like to see in the future, please leave a comment below. And if you want to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.